the difference it makes to know that God has placed me where I am, is that I'm just really free to see what good works God has prepared for me wherever I am. And having seen God's faithfulness over and over and over again just makes me more and more excited and curious what will come next, rather than trying to do God's job for him by trying to take control.
Well, the journeying thing, I think, is two things. It's you can't just dump the gospel and run, but it's also thinking about how foreign the church culture and church community and church services, etc., are if you put yourself in the non-Christian shoes. So it used to be the case that folk would know about Christianity, they'd know about church, they might have gone Sunday school when they were kids, etc. That was certainly the case for me. But the more I speak to my colleagues and my neighbours and the people at the school gate, I realise they've got no Christian background whatsoever. So to expect them to go from nothing to, okay, I'll sacrifice my Sunday morning and bring my family, I'll break all the habits that we've got for weekends, and I'll just come to this church service of yours and watch you sing and, talk for half an hour and, all that sort of stuff. It's just a very, very big jump. So we have to find a way of showing them Jesus in the scriptures, in the Christian community, as we explain the gospel to them and help them understand the implications of Jesus, his death, his resurrection.
I think we're all evangelists, whether we know it or not, because we do actually go into the world, we interact with people. You don't have to stand on a soapbox and talk at people. I think the way that you respond to things is important. So if you're in a meeting or you're in an environment where someone says a dirty joke or does something, the way you respond as a Christian will speak to people. And I think the way you treat people, if you treat people with respect and kindness and actually are not like other people, and then if people do ask you, if you speak honestly and give examples about your own life, then you're evangelizing. So I'd say, don't think it's complicated. Don't think that it's beyond anyone. Just be yourself and share your faith. And I think people will see you as being truthful and valuable.
Who am I? Where have I come from? And where am I going? These are huge questions that everyone asks, either consciously or subconsciously. And one of the core aspects of a passion for life, and one of the things that we're going to pick up in this module, is thinking about what journey I'm on and what journey those around me are on, the people whom God has put in my life. And we want to take the good news of Jesus all the way from the Creator God who made us to the streets that we live on. We long for people to link their story with his. One of my favourite passages for training on evangelism, which boosts my confidence as I draw alongside others to share my faith, is Acts 17, verses 24 to 27.
The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us.
So first question, how does this passage tell us to think about God. Can you see how God is described in verse 24? How is he described in verse 25 and verse 26? What we see is that God is the creator in verse 24. He made the world and everything in it. He's the sustainer in verse 25. He himself gives life and breath and everything else. So just breathe in and out and realize that breath, each breath, is a gift, not a given. And thirdly, he is the ruler who made all the nations and who then decides our appointed times in history and the boundaries of our lands. In other words, he decides where we live and how long we live. What is the creator, sustainer, and ruler doing in history? That's the question. What's he doing? What's his aim for the world? Well, that comes in verse 27. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. God makes us, sustains us, and rules us in order that we would meet Jesus. That is what's happening in history. And he has decided not only that I live on the street I live on here in central London, but that my neighbours live here as well. They think they're here because of choices they've made. And of course, they have made real choices. But that does not stop God from being God. My neighbours live on my street because God has put them there. Your colleague at work sits next to you because God has sat him or her there. Every person and family is where they are because God has ordained it. God's sovereign control of history is profoundly depicted in the book of Acts, where we read about one of the first prayer meetings of the early church. Peter and John have just been released from their trial before the Sanhedrin. They've been told to be quiet, to stop speaking, chapter 4, verse 17. But when they come to pray in verse 27-28, they tell us how to think about God.
Indeed, Herod and Pontius Pilate met together with the Gentiles and the people of Israel in this city to conspire against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed.
We then read of the sin of Herod, the sin of Pontius Pilate, the sin of the Romans, and the sin of the people, who conspired together to crucify Jesus. And then, now hold on to your seats, we read this.
They did what your power and will had decided beforehand should happen.
So you have to be very, very powerful to have your enemies do your bidding while acting against you. But that's exactly how we're to think about God. Returning to my street, it tells me that every neighbour, despite the fact that they perhaps suppress all knowledge of God, has been placed here for what reason? To meet me, because I know Jesus. What's going on in history is that God is reaching out to people so that they'll meet him. The reason your neighbour lives on your street is that so that they can be reached by the gospel. It's no accident that God has brought these people across your path. And to see this is life transforming. It means that every encounter is a divine appointment that God has already written into my schedule and into their schedule. It transforms my energy and optimism because every time I see a neighbour or colleague, I know that the God who is in charge on Good Friday is in charge today. And so I can say to myself with all humility, I'm the most important person they know because I know Jesus, and the creator, sustainer, and ruler insists that life is about encountering his son. As I teach this truth as an evangelist, it's such a privilege because I literally watch people's confidence being transformed by it. But this also raises our next question. If God is ruling like this in history, why does he use Christians to journey with non-Christians towards faith in Jesus? Well, amazingly, he chooses you to be his ambassador, and how you're needed. As we know, the culture we live in is defined by tolerance and permissiveness, and is far removed from biblical Christianity. Jesus simply hasn't been on the agenda at all for years, and people generally don't think about why they disagree with your beliefs, and if they do, they put it in the "it's fine for you but not for me" box. That's what's going on in their head. Our job, and what a privilege it is to introduce them to Jesus, having been placed in their lives as we journey with them through life. So, how do people become Christians in this climate? Well, statistics show that the majority of people who come to faith do so through the positive influence of a Christian who was their link to Christianity and helped them to take steps towards faith in Jesus. As I think about my personal relationships and journeying with people, I have 4 steps in mind, 4 steps that guide my thinking, prayer, and interaction with the people that God has placed around me. Step 1, know them. The first thing I want to do is know them. They're made in God's image, Genesis 1 verse 27. They're the pinnacle of creation, and God has sent me to meet them. Now, what does that mean? It means that to get to know them, I take the time to speak with them and ask friendly questions. David tells us in Psalm 139 verse 14 that they're fearfully and wonderfully made. So how thrilling it is that God has put them into my life and nothing has happened by accident. God made them with their skills, temperament, intellect, and experience. He uniquely wired them. And evangelism begins here in being thrilled with the fact that God has made this person opposite me, alongside me. He's put me in their life. He sent Christ to die for them, and he's put me in their life to meet them. Oh, may they see the excitement in my eyes as I realize the big story we're in together. It's so thrilling. Step 2, serve them. We don't just want to get to know people, we also want to serve them. In 1 Peter 2, we're urged to live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. The people we meet may be hostile to Christianity. Certainly in Peter's day, there were tiny pockets of faith surrounded by great oceans of paganism. Following the Emperor Nero's lead, vast parts of the country were persecuting Christians. And yet, as people saw their good deeds, they were so often won over by the lives of these Christians. Observers at the time noted that the Christians walked in all humility and kindness. There was no falsehood among them, and they loved one another. They cared for widows and orphans and gave generously to those in need. So strangers were welcomed and shown hospitality. The grieving were supported in practical ways, and those imprisoned for their faith were cared for. There was real sacrifice made for others, including fasting from food for several days so that they may supply the needy. So as I interact with the neighbour God has put in my life, I need to constantly be looking out to do random acts of kindness. When someone arrives on the street, knock on the door with recycling bags and a box of chocolates. When you see them, make sure you stop and let them know you care by asking how they are. Get to know their stories. If there's a local fair, get the street together to go. If someone's had a success, celebrate it. For example, one of my neighbours wrote a book. As a way of celebrating and serving them, my other neighbours and I organised for those that could to go to the launch. It's a small thing, but it meant a lot to the people who came and, of course, to the guy who wrote the book. Third step, cross the pain line and ask spiritual questions. This will always be a bit nerve-wracking, so make sure your identity is in the grace of God, so that whether they accept or reject you doesn't make you more valuable what makes you valuable is Christ died for you. Get that in place. But something you might find helpful is to preface what you say with perhaps a comment like this. Our friendship is really important. So I'm a little bit nervous about saying this because some people can be offended. But can I ask you, what do you think about spiritual things? Do you ever think about spiritual things? What do you think about the person of Christ? Do you celebrate Christmas? What do you make of Easter? In the recent coronavirus pandemic, I found myself asking this question of people. In the midst of the pandemic, with all the death tolls on the telly each night, do you have a hope for a time like this? Is there a place of hope you've got? Let's remember in the Gospels, Jesus asks over 300 questions. And as a minority in the country, we've got to get better at asking questions that help people reflect on their worldviews. What have they absorbed? How are they thinking? What is their core thinking? So with an individual, I'll often use 3 key words to help me work out what might be the right question for them. First, explore. Listen, listen, listen. What are they thinking? What do they love? What are their concerns? What are their hopes and fears? Secondly, explain. What's the next thing I'd love to say to them about the Christian faith? What truth about Jesus would I love them to understand? What is it about creation, fall, redemption, consummation, those 4 great planks of the Christian worldview that I'd love them to know? Thirdly, encourage. What from my life as I share my story brings that truth to light? So, for example, during the coronavirus lockdowns, I kept saying to people, these death tolls remind me of how I felt 40 years ago when my godfather was suddenly killed in a cliff fall. I realized I needed hope in the face of death. I woke up to that. It's like the same feeling now. And that leads to the 4th step. Know when to exit. In Matthew 10 verse 14, Jesus says that if anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or town and shake the dust off your feet. So what does this mean? Well, I think it means that if they shut up, you shut up. But if they start talking and discussing the spiritual issues you've raised, then you keep asking questions and engaging with them. Now, it might be that they don't want to talk about this area at all, in which case, go back to knowing and serving them. But it might be that this is someone in whom God is creating a spiritual hunger. And that has led them to this conversation with you so that you may offer them the only thing that will satisfy them, the Lord Jesus. Don't make the assumption you know who's hungry, who is ready to trust in Jesus and who isn't. Get to know people, serve them, ask questions, and God will show you who he's calling to himself through you. This is the journey I'm seeking to go on with everyone God has placed on my street and elsewhere in my life. My confidence comes from the fact that the sovereign Lord has placed me where I am and my neighbours where they are. It's all a divine appointment that God has written into our schedules. When I think of these things, they give me energy and optimism. They make me ready to speak. They make every walk down the street so exciting, and it makes me thankful to God. And it means that my next job is to think about or write down the names of the people living around me and start praying for them. With my confidence absolutely rock solid in God's plan for me, for them and his world, I can pray that I would know them, serve them, and speak with them about Jesus.